Hello everyone, this is Mr. McMillan and I'm here with an instructional video on the notes for the basics of determining congruence. Okay, so we've just discussed and gotten through with the unit on basic triangle properties, and now we're going to be talking about how to determine the congruence of triangles. But first we have to talk about corresponding parts, okay? Now, if you remember, when we talk about congruence, we're talking about things that are exactly the same. They're the same size, same shape, same measurements, everything else like that, okay? And an important part of that is corresponding parts, okay? So corresponding parts, if you remember when we talked about corresponding angles, we talked about things that were in matching locations. So corresponding parts are literally just matching parts. Okay, so let's look at that. So consider triangle ABC and triangle DEF as shown below. Imagine that triangle ABC slides over to fit exactly on triangle DEF. When the vertices of the triangle are matched this way, the following statements are true. So we're taking ABC and we're sliding it over on top of DEF. And you can see they're arranged the same way. So let's look at our corresponding angles. So in other words, this would be the ones that would overlap exactly. So for example, if you're talking about angle A, which one would be corresponding with it? And you should see that angle A and D would overlap. They would match. They're in matching locations. So angle A and angle D are corresponding angles. All right, well, what about another pair of angles? What other pair of angles is corresponding? Well, we see B up here and E up here. Those are corresponding. And then finally, C and F. So all this is just the angles are in matching locations, okay? But we can also do this for the sides, right? Now remember, to name a side, you have to use 2 points, right? So for instance, AB, what side corresponds to AB? Well, if we look here in this document here, we see that DE would correspond to AB. So line segment AB and DE are corresponding sides. All right, are there any other corresponding sides here? There are 2 other ones. We also see that BC and EF are corresponding. And then finally, we see that the other side, AC and DF, are corresponding as well. Okay? So, corresponding angles and corresponding sides are examples of corresponding parts. In the corresponding parts, of course, we just have sides and angles for our triangles. So those are our corresponding parts. Figures are congruent if all pairs of corresponding angles and all pairs of corresponding sides are congruent. If 2 figures are congruent, we can indicate this by writing a congruent statement. So in other words, the matching parts, the corresponding parts, have to be exactly the same for the figures to be congruent. And this is just congruent figures and not congruent figures. So congruent figures are ones that are the same size, shape, and measurements. And not congruent ones are different size, shapes, and measurements. Okay. So let's jump into an example here. We want to write a congruent statement and list all corresponding parts for the figures below. Now, if you'll notice here on these diagrams, we have a bunch of markings. We see some markings on the sides. We see that there's different numbers of them, and we also see that for the angles. The corresponding parts will be the ones that have exactly the same number of diagram markings. So we're looking for matching diagram markings. Matching diagram markings, okay? So our corresponding angles. From the diagram here, what would be our corresponding angles? Well, we can see right off the bat, we have L. L has one semicircle, one arc in it, and so does Y. So we know that angle L is congruent to angle Y. Okay. We also see that K has two angle measures. Which one on the other triangle has two arcs in it? Which one matches up with K? That would be X. So angle K is congruent to angle X. And then finally, M has three arcs on it, and so does Z. So angle M is congruent to angle Z. Now let's look at our corresponding sides. We're going to do it the exact same way. We're looking for matching diagram markings. We see that KM has one tick mark on it on the side. The side that has one tick mark on it from the other is XZ. So KM is congruent to XZ. All right, can you spot another one that would be a set of corresponding sides? You should be able to see that KL would be congruent to XY because they have the exact same number of diagram markings. And you should also be able to see that LM, which has three markings, is congruent to YZ because it also has three markings. Okay. So now let's talk about the possible congruent statements, okay? We've done some congruent statements here, but what we're gonna do here is the triangle congruent statements, okay? So we're doing the triangle congruence. So we're gonna have to talk about the triangles as a whole. Well, to start with, we're gonna name it triangle, and we'll start with KLM. And this is congruent. Now, to write the congruent statement, look at where K is. Which angle corresponds to K? It has to go first because K is first in line. Well, we said that K and X were corresponding, so we're going to write X. What corresponds to L? Well, we said L corresponds to Y. And finally, that leaves us with Z. Okay, well, what if I wrote triangle MKL? Well, M corresponds with Z. M corresponds with Z. Okay. Then K corresponds with X. And then L corresponds with Y. And then just giving you another one here, LMK. L corresponds to Y. M corresponds to Z, and K corresponds to X. There are three other congruent statements that you could write. I'm only listing these three, but there are 6 different congruent statements for the triangles that you can arrange in those manners. Okay, so basically what you're looking for is in a congruent statement, you're looking at the order. Corresponding angles and corresponding sides come in the same order. So take, for example, we said KL was congruent to XY. KL is here in the first 2 spots. Is XY in the first 2 spots as well? Yes, it is. Okay, and you can see that for every single one of those. All right, so let's move on to some example problems. So notice that the number of congruency markings matters in the diagram. I apologize for the lights. Matters in the diagrams. Sides with the same number of markings are congruent, and angles with the same number of markings are congruent. So in these problems, it wants us to do this. For each of the pairs of triangles given below, write a statement that indicates they are congruent. And we only have to write one. There's 6 different ones that we can write, but we're only going to write one. Okay? So let's look at number 1. We have 2 triangles here, and we have a bunch of congruence markings, right? And we're going to be using these to our advantage. So let's take, for example, I'm going to write this as triangle VWU. Now, the order matters the way you write these congruent statements. So triangle VWU is congruent to triangle. Now, V has 2 angle markings here. What angle from the other side or other triangle has 2 markings? Well, that would be angle T. So we write T first, then we go to W. It has 3 markings. R does as well. And then U has 1, and the only one left is S. Now let's say, for example, that I wanted to write it as triangle WUV. Well, we do the same process. W has 3, R has 3. U has 1, S has 1. V has 2, T has 2. Okay? And that's just 2 of the possible congruent statements there, just going based on our diagram markings. All right, let's look at number 2. Number 2, I'm going to start out with this triangle here. So I'm going to start out with triangle. I'm going to do HJI. HJI. And you might do it differently than me, and that's fine. HJI. Now, H here is a shared point. Just because H is listed first does not mean it's always going to be listed first. You have to make sure you pay attention to the angles. So in this triangle, H has 3 here. Does it have 3 in here? Yes, it does. So we can list H first. J was listed next, which has 1. Well, W would be congruent to it. And then finally X. Another one we could do IHJ. I has 2, X has 2. H has 3 on both sides. And W matches with J. Okay? So that is the gist of doing the congruence statements. Okay? We're going to do 2 more together, and then I'll have you guys pause the video and do the last 4. So let's look at number 3. So number 3, we have a triangle, and it's conjoined with a line segment in the middle. They share a side, okay? But you're still gonna go based on basically the angles. You could also do it the sides, but the angles tend to be easier. So let's say I'm gonna do the top triangle first. So triangle, I'm gonna say QSR. Well, Q has 3. On the bottom triangle, C has 3. Then we go to S, which has 1. Well, from C, we have to go to R to get to the 1. And then we have to go to S. Okay, let's try it a different way. RSQ. Congruent. R has 2. S has 2 here. Then we go to 1 for R. And then we have to go to C because it has 3 and corresponds with Q. All right, number 4. Number 4, we're going to start out with, I want to start out with triangle LKJ. L has 3 markings here. The other one that has 3 markings is T. Then we're doing K. K has 2. U has 2. And then J is just chilling there with its own. Another one we could do, KJL is congruent to K has 2, U has 2, J has 1 on both ends because it's vertical, and then L matches up with T. Okay, so make sure you pay attention to the diagrams that you have. All right, so I want you guys to try 5 through 8. I'm not going to list out every single possible answer for there, but I will give you one, and then you can kind of extrapolate for one to figure out what you're missing. Okay, so go ahead, pause the video, try numbers 5 through 8, and then check back and see how you did. All right, let's look at number 5. So one possible one for number 5, triangle STU is congruent to triangle UYZ. Another one that you could use, triangle TUS is congruent to triangle YZU, and so on and so forth. Number 6, we could say that we have triangle IMJ being congruent to triangle I has 2, so does N, then M, and then L. We might also say that we have JIM. J matches up with L, I matches up with N, and M matches up with itself. Number 7, we could say we have triangle MNL, congruent. M matches up with I. Then we go to N because it also has one here, and then L. And then number 8, we could say that we have triangle HGF, which is congruent. H matches up with V, G matches up with X, and F matches up with W. They don't have to be in this exact order. Again, there's 6 different ways you can write them. So if you got one that makes sense, good on you. All right, let's flip on over here. This time we're going to do what we were doing before, and but basically in reverse. So this time it wants us to mark the angles and sides of each pair of triangles to indicate that they are congruent. Okay, so what I like to do when I want to mark these angles and sides is I want to look at my congruent statement, because that's what you're going to be basing your markings off of. And I like to see if they have any connections. If they don't, then I can just read this off just plain as it is. And number 1 doesn't have any connections. So if we look here, we have X, triangle XYZ, and triangle BCD. Well, X is in the first position. What is the corresponding angle to X? Well, the corresponding angle will be in the same position. B is in the first position. So X and B are congruent. Then if we look at Y, Y is in the second position. C is in the second position. So Y and C are congruent. And then that leaves Z and D as the other congruent angles. Now let's mark the sides. We have XY and BC. They're in the first 2 spots. Then we have YZ and CD, because they're in the second and third, respectively. And then we have XZ and BD. Okay. Now, I'm not going to actually go through all 8 of these. I'm going to go through the first 4. The rest of them should be fairly straightforward, and I'm not going to cover them in this video. If you would like to see what the diagram should be marked as, you can see the answer key or the completed set of notes in the along with the video. All right, number 2, we have triangle RPQ is congruent to triangle HGQ. Now this one does have a shared point here, but we're gonna just look at what we have. So triangle R is in the first position, H is in the first position, so R and H are congruent. Then we have P in the second position and G in the second position, so P and G are congruent, excuse me. And so that means that Q is congruent to itself on both sides. Next up is our sides. We're going to look at the first two to start with, R and P, so they're in 1 and 2. And another thing that some people might find helpful is doing this when they want to find it. So R and P are in 1, 2. And the ones that are in 1, 2 in HG, or is HG, excuse me. 2 and 3 have P and Q, and 2 and 3 have G and Q. So PQ here, and then GQ here. And then finally 1 and 3 R and Q, 1 and 3 H and Q. So those are the only ones left that are congruent. All right. Number 3, triangle TSU is congruent to triangle TSM. So here we have a shared side and everything else. So what I'm going to do here is, since the angles match up so well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the sides first. Okay, so obviously we know that TS has to be congruent to TS because it's a shared side, right? Well, then if I look here, I have SU, which is here, and then SM, which is here. And then 1 and 3, we have T and U, so TU, which is here, and then TM here. Now, if you're struggling with determining what to mark your angles as, which ones to mark congruent, look at your sides. Do you notice here how this has 1 mark, this has 2, this has 2? That means that the angles between here have to be congruent, okay? So the angles here have to be congruent with one another, okay? Now look at your congruent statement. We see in position 3, we have U and M, right? U and M. They're congruent. We know that for a fact. Do you see how U and M are both between 2 sides that have the same markings, 2 and 3 markings respectively? Okay, so that's one way that you can figure that out, and that's going to be very important in the next lesson that we're going to be having in a couple days. Okay, so we know that S is congruent to itself here, and we know that T is also congruent. Then number 4, first thing I want to point out here on number 4 before we even look at the congruent statement, look at where U is. Those types of angles, they're vertical. And remember that vertical angles are always congruent. So that means right off the bat, we know that those two are congruent. Well, next up, we've got angle S and angle D in position 2. And then in position 3, we have T and E. So those have to be congruent. Next up, we're going to do our sides. So our first 2 spots are U and S. Then the first 2 spots in the other one are U and D. Next up is S and T in 2 and 3. Then 2 and 3 and the other one has D, E. And then the last one has to be there. So like I said, I'm not going to go over the numbers 5 through 8. I think you get the point with 1 through 4. And this is not something that I do mostly virtual anyway. Okay. All right, so let's look at the next one. Next page, this is the last page of the notes that we're going to cover for today. The other part's going to be covered in a bell work video that we're going to be going over in a couple of days before the next instructional video. Okay. So notice that the order in a congruent statement does matter. Corresponding parts must be written in the same order. The congruent angles will line up in the congruent statement. The congruent sides will also line up in the congruent statement. So given the congruent statements below, name all corresponding parts using the correct congruent statements for each part. So we're going to do these three, and then you guys can do 4 through 6 on your own and check it with the included set of notes, okay? So number 1, triangle GEF is congruent to triangle JHI. Now these have no shared points. So all we're looking at here is your positions. I do apologize for the constant coughing and stuttering and all this other stuff. So we're going to label these 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 to help out a little bit if need be. So angle G is in position 1. J is also in position 1. So angle G is congruent to angle J. Then our next one, angle E, has to be congruent to angle H. And then finally, angle F has to be congruent to angle I. Okay, then we're going to look at our sides. We're going to do the exact same process. Well, our sides here, we have GE in positions 1 and 2. That matches up with JH. So GE is congruent to JH. Next up is EF and HI. And then finally 1 and 3 is GF and 1 and 3 is JI. So we have GF is congruent to JI. And you don't need to fill out the diagram. The diagram is just there to help you visualize it if need be. All right, let's look at number 2. Now number 2 is going to be a little bit unique because it has some connections here between the two triangles. So let's look and see how that affects things. So we're going to be doing the angles and the sides, just like normal. I'm going to go ahead and do the sides. Okay. So if it helps, order or list your order here. So the sides, FG is in positions 1 and 2. FT is in positions 1 and 2 for the other. Then we'll look at 2 and 3 here. We've got GH, and then here we have TU. So GH is congruent to TU. And then we have HF and UF. Now let's look at the angles. Now you notice here that these would be congruent because they are vertical angles. But here's the thing. There's a time way back when we talked about it like 10 weeks ago or longer if you're watching this video later that talked about how we named angles, okay? And there were 2 ways we named angles. One is how we've been doing it over here. The other is with 3 letters, with the vertex being in the middle. So for instance, we see here we have G, or we have angles F. We don't know which angle F that belongs to, or which triangle it belongs to. So what we need to do is we need to say angle, and then we say GFH is congruent to angle. And now we're dealing with this triangle. So now we do TFU. And that deals with that one. All right, next up we're going to see the next bit here. We have position 2, we have G, and then T. So angle G is congruent to angle T. And we can do that because we know that G and T are on separate triangles and there's no shared sides there. And we have H and U. And then finally, number 3, we have triangle TUV is congruent to triangle IVK. We're going to do our sides again first and then our angles. The sides tend to be a little bit less complicated. So the sides we have TU is congruent to IV. Then we have UV is congruent to VK. And then TV is congruent to IK. So that's our sides. Now let's talk about our angles, okay? So let's look here. We're gonna start out with angle T. Now T is here by itself and it matches up with I, which is also by itself. So angle T is congruent to angle I. Now let's look at U. Now U is by itself, so we can list angle U. But notice here how it says angle, or it says V. Now V is a shared point, so there's 2 different angles in the 2 different triangles. Well, U is part of this triangle. So the other angle here has to be this one. So these 2 have to be congruent here. And so we would say it would be KVI. Then we have V again. Well, V is part of this one, so it'd have to be TVU or UVT. Doesn't matter. TVU. And then from here, and then from here we had that it was congruent to angle K. Okay. And that does it for this instructional video, guys. I hope that this instructional video has helped. There is a graded assignment on this stuff. It is like 40 questions, but most of them are just asking you to determine what angle is congruent to the given angle. Okay. So next time we will talk about this page here, which is just some applications of what we just talked about. But until then, guys, I hope that you guys are working on what you need to be working on and are just doing the best that you can with what you have. Okay. If you need any help, please make sure to email me, let me know. I can't help you unless you let me know. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.